My name is Piers Bocock, and I am the Director of Knowledge Management and Communication for the CGIAR Consortium. A big part of my is around to improve the way that we share and communicate information and knowledge both internally and externally. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in for this webinar. It's really exciting to see all of the interest in open access in general, and more specifically in how CGI data and information can be made more widely available, accessible, and applicable. The presentation I'm going to share with you today is called CGIAR Open Access, Progress, and Promise. It provides an overview of the progress to date within the CGIAR Consortium in our move towards open access and what our next steps are, including a comprehensive advocacy campaign which ties in nicely with the advocacy toolkit on the CGIAR website, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the presentation will start with a brief overview of CGIAR and its various components to lay the foundation. It's a complicated organization, and perhaps to paint a picture of the complicated nature of trying to lead a change in culture to enable open access. I'll walk you through our progress so far, look at planned next steps, talk about some of the challenges we have, and the opportunities to address them through advocacy, and then we'll open it up to questions. I suspect most of you are familiar with CGIAR, but just in case, let me briefly provide an overview. CGIAR refers to the world's largest global research partnership for a food secure future. We unite organizations, including research centers, donors, implementers, and farmers, working towards food security. There are 5 main components that fall under the CGIAR umbrella, so to speak: partners and stakeholders, coordinated through GFAR; the CGIAR Consortium, which includes our 15 research centers, the Consortium Office, and the Consortium Board; the CGIAR Fund, which includes the Fund Council, the Funders Forum, and the Fund Office; the Independent Evaluation Arrangement, or IEA, and the Independent Science and Partnership Council, or ISPC. So I work for the CGIAR Consortium, but I coordinate with the other entities. But when we're talking about open access in this presentation, we're primarily talking about the CGIAR Consortium. As I mentioned, the CGIAR Consortium includes 15 centers, which are members of the Consortium of International Agriculture Research Centers. They're spread across the world, and in some cases, they've been in existence for more than 40 years. Historically, one of the great challenges for CGIAR has been how to better coordinate and synergize the work of these centers so that we can leverage and collaborate better, both internally and externally. For the past 5 years, CGIAR has been undergoing a reform effort to do this, which has been driven by a new approach to research, which is trying to get research not just into papers, but actually into use. And also through a cross-cutting approach, which we call the CGIAR Research Programs, or CRPs. These are global cross-cutting programs that combine the work of multiple research centers to tackle specific issues. This slide shows the 16 cross-cutting research programs. In some cases, such as rice, there are just 2 main centers collaborating, along with hundreds of partners, IRRI and Africa Rice. In other cases, such as our CGIAR program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, or CCAFS, all 15 research centers are partners on the project. And then along with these programs, there are 3 cross-cutting themes. You see those at the top: gender, partnership and stakeholder engagement, and capacity development. All of the research programs work towards 4 system-level outcomes, which are our CGIAR ultimate goals: reduced poverty, increased food security, improved nutrition and health, and sustainably managed natural resources. This slide simply shows those same 4 system-level outcomes, our main focus, as well as the number and type of partners we have. Actually, this number is from 2012, so we're now well over 4,000 partners. And we've actually sort of divided these up into different types of organizations in the partnerships, and you'll see that national research institutions are actually our biggest partners in this. But through our CGIAR research programs, we're adding new partners every day and trying to find ways to get our research closer to those who are ultimate beneficiaries. So now that I've put the CGIAR and CGIAR Consortium in perspective, I just needed to do that. to lay the foundation. Let's actually turn to open access. So those of you who've been working with CGIAR Consortium for some time, including the ICT-KM program led by Enrica Porcari, know that open access is not new within CGIAR. Johannes referred to this. Many centers and groups have been working towards this ideal for some time, but a new formality was added in 2012. In April of 2012, CGIAR officially adopted what's called its Principles on Management of Intellectual Assets. And the key language for open access in that document was what was Article 6.1, which states, the consortium and the centers shall promptly and broadly disseminate their research results, subject to confidentiality, etc., etc. So that laid the groundwork and the legal requirement, but then the question became how to do this, and that became the real challenge. So this slide shows the major milestones to date since that time. As I said, the key driver was the approval of the CGIAR Intellectual Assets Principles document in April of 2012. And then in September of 2012, more than 50 science leaders, knowledge management, data management, information management, and IP experts convened in Montpellier to identify key knowledge management priorities. And the development of a CGIAR open access policy was identified as the #1 priority. So getting from that lofty language of we should get all of our research results out promptly, how do we move that forward? The first step was a policy that we could actually get everybody to agree to. I attended that workshop in September as an observer before joining the consortium officially at the end of October of 2012. In November, we formed a cross-consortium open access working group charged with drafting the policy. But as you can imagine, getting 15 research centers to agree to one policy that would fundamentally change the way we disseminate research was no easy task, and it took a number of months and iterations. But by October 2013, we secured approval of the CGIAR Consortium. In November, we secured the approval of all 15 research centers. This then paved the way to start looking at how to actually implement. And I'll get into some of the key components of the policy in a few slides. Now, while we were negotiating, drafting, and redrafting the policy, we were also looking at how to work with donors to secure funding to support this work, because one of the key pushbacks and pieces of feedback we got around the policy was, hey, you know, this is a big change. How are we going to actually implement this? It's going to take some resources. And as most of you know, donors have been a key driver for open access on a number of fronts, and that's no different for CGIAR. One donor in particular committed $5 million to support this work, and the CGIAR Fund Council, who funds all of our work, requested a proposal for more potential funding in November of 2013. In January and February, we revised that proposal, which now sits with the Fund Council and will be debated next month, early next month, at the Fund Council meeting, at which point we hope to receive positive news for around $15 million worth of everything, but it will be important seed funding to help the centers and the research programs move forward on this initiative. So policy, funding, then of course the next piece of this was actually guidelines to support this policy. Those guidelines have also been a challenge, trying to strike balance between helpfulness and flexibility, and we've gone through 2 rounds already and are close to having a 3rd round ready for review. So this next slide tries to show that it's not just the policy, the funding, and the guidelines that are necessary to actually make this a reality. Because after we actually put the guidelines agreed to, it's going to be up to the centers, the CGIAR Consortium research centers and their research programs to develop their own implementation plans and actually start implementing, provided they policy. But even that's not enough. There are plenty of centers already making a number of documents and data sets openly accessible. But what we're shooting for is the open access, open data model, whereby all CGIAR open repositories abide by the same metadata standards, thereby making the data and information interoperable and machine readable. And then for me, one of the keys is evaluating this. conducting a good impact assessment to be able to show how and to what degree better availability, accessibility, and applicability contributes to ultimate impact. Now, one of the challenges to implementing a major open access initiative such as this is that the open access touches many, many communities. And while we've been trying to lead the policy development and funding and guidelines, it's not just data managers and publication teams and knowledge managers. It impacts ICT when we talk about databases and platforms. It relates to human resources when we talk about incentives to publish open access and behave in a more open access. It impacts legal and IP teams. Clearly, most of all, impacts our researchers who have not necessarily been working in the model. So we need to keep all of these communities in mind and engaged when we talk about open access and advocacy for open access. So just briefly on the status of some of these, as I mentioned, the consortium open access policy is complete, has been approved by all 15 centers, and is now mandatory, although there's a 5-year window for full implementation. And if you want to take a look at that policy, it's available at www.cgir.org/open, along with a number of other resources related to open access, news, etc., etc. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the key parts of the policy and where some of the controversies or pushback came about. I've titled this slide Aggressive and Aspirational. Aggressive because what it calls for are pretty tough timelines for making various elements openly accessible. For example, we're calling for publications to be available no later than 6 publication and data sets within 12 months of our publication. However, aspirational because we know that this is something we have to move towards. It's going to take time. We know that publishers often have embargoes that may prohibit compliance with these timelines, though we are trying to work with a number of them to come to mutually agreeable solutions. And of course, some data sets just don't lend themselves to being ready within 12 months. And then some people say, well, what is completion if it's a multi-year data collection effort? So we have to keep these things in mind, but we are aspiring to pretty lofty goals. And it is important, I often have to remind people within CGIAR that what we're talking about here is not every single piece of data and information. We're starting with the final products. The publications, associated data sets, the reports, the videos, the software, the metadata. We're not talking about notebooks with data. We're not talking about partial spreadsheets. So that is an important point. Now, when we talk about the guidelines, as I mentioned, we're still working on those. Now, we started this effort in October of 2013. We published the first round and put it on that open page on cgir.org. and got a lot of feedback. This was open to the public as well as to CGIAR research and programs. We got our feedback and we released a second draft in January, but it's very, very clear that we still don't have it right. It's a long document. It's 40 pages, and we got a lot of feedback from centers that actually, it was too prescriptive. So our next step on this is actually redrafting that document into a more generic set of implementation guidelines that include just clear essential actions, and then supported by an online, what we're calling a support pack of generic guidelines, samples, templates, suggestions that continually grows. We presented this redraft to a meeting of our knowledge management leaders from across the CGIAR Consortium in Lima last month, got their feedback, and we're hoping to have a new version later this month for approval, hopefully in May. When we talk about the essential elements, one of the keys here that we're constantly trying to balance in the consortium is providing enough guidance and then balancing that with the flexibility so that centers can develop plans that meet their specific situations. But at a minimum, what the centers have agreed to is that their individual plan should comply with the overall policy. They need to address issues of research ethics, governance around open access. They need to identify their core metadata and then be able to crosswalk to a set of CGIAR core metadata and somehow include perpetual access principles. This is especially important around the research programs, which are not as long-standing as centers themselves. The other thing that we're clearly calling for is the use of open repositories that, as I said, would at a minimum abide by this core metadata that we're trying to put together, relate to Dublin Core, are harvestable, machine readable, and are measurable. List of predatory journals, suggestions of how to publish and publish gold, green, and self-archiving. Repository options for those who are not yet using open repositories, sample ethics guidance, standards, examples of HR contracts that have good open access incentives, controlled vocabularies. AgriVoc will be a key part of this. Sample workflows, promising practices. The things that was important, this was actually to outline the roles and responsibilities and trying to distinguish between what is the role of the consortium office and where my team works with the roles of the center. So the consortium is essentially responsible for the guidelines and the policy and the curation of the support pack. And then looking at when there are opportunities for negotiations, say with publishers, that would benefit the entire consortium. The centers then, the research centers, become responsible for their own implementation plans as long as they are compliant with the overall open access policy. And then the CRP, our research programs, comply with the policy through the lead centers. There are two groups that we're forming that are going to help ensure that this gets implemented across the consortium. One is called the Open Access Implementation Working Group that has representation from all of the centers and some of the CRPs that serves as a kind of core advisory group, and then the Data Management Task Force, which will be responsible for working with the different type of data we work with, looking at the core metadata and making other standards recommendations. So when we talk about the draft metadata schema, we have that is what will actually make all of this glue stick together, because what we're not trying to do is build the ultimate single repository of all publications and data. We're not building the open access Death Star, as some people call it. What we're looking to do is allow each center to have their own open repositories that use a common metadata schema such that we can then harvest that up into a metadata repository, and it can be shared and interoperable with our partners. We've drafted this metadata scheme, and then it's going to be reviewed by the Data Management Task Force. Basically, it's based on Dublin Core and some open air elements. And if and when we can get those put in place, that will help to ensure the overall interoperability and harvestability. Let me talk a bit about funding. As I mentioned, we have one who has already committed $5 million to support this effort over the next 3 years. And then the CGIAR Fund Council, as I mentioned, has requested a full proposal which would include that $5 million, but for more. And that proposal for 5 years is for $15.4 million. And we are hoping to hear some good news May 7th or May 8th. Basically, the funding would support two phases of development that would lead towards ultimate compliance within 5 years. I know it may sound like a long time, but these research centers have been doing business in a certain way for a long time. It will take some time to get these repositories all compliant with the metadata. So we're looking at the first 2 years of kind of scaling up and figuring out how it will work, and then scaling it up over the following 3 years. And as I mentioned, it's a distributed model of interoperable repositories residing at centers that would then be able to be harvested up to a metadata repository. The funding that we're talking about would help support the centers, the research programs, and partners to do certain elements of open access compliance, and we see these as grants. It would also go towards some staffing who would sit in our research programs or centers to help coordinate, and also to some of the platforms. But the bulk of the work and the bulk of the funding is actually for centers and CRPs and partners for these subgrants. So briefly, next steps, and these are fairly aggressive next steps, but just to give you guys all a sense of where we're trying to go, we got to form Open Access Implementation Working Group. We're very close to doing that. The data management, and then finalize the implement guidelines. Once we've done that, we actually have to draft guidelines for how people will access that funding. And then the big piece that we want to start soon is the advocacy element, because we've got to start reaching out more than we have already about actually how to implement and the value of open access and why we're doing this. We've been conducting a baseline study of all of our centers to find out what they have, where they have it. And then we have a big and important meeting in Rome in a couple of weeks with CGIAR and GODAN, April 22nd through 24th. If we get our funding approval, then we're going to start on our side on actually developing the metadata repository, which will sit at open.cgiar.org, and actually how we start to build that. Then we're going to start on a couple of other related elements, the spatial commons, and a potential use case might be a project that we've been working on with a number of partners, including FARA and the African SROs, called the Africa Agriculture Technology Platform. And that's AATP that you see there, and VIP stands for Information Platform. Because what we want to do here is not just create an academic tool. We want to create a tool that provides content and data that is useful for decision making all along the value chain. So how do we synthesize a lot of that information and data to make it useful to those closer to the ground? In June, we hope to start really ramping up that advocacy campaign that I've mentioned, and we will be working closely with the advocacy toolkit and the advocacy pathway that are part of the CGIAR ring, and starting to build the evidence base to help make the case for why we're doing this. We want this to be something not just that people do because they have to do it, but because they see the value of doing it. As we get closer to the end of the year, I mean, I'd really want to start on looking at metrics and evaluation and the overall incentives that need to be put in place and what the impact assessment will look like, and then working towards some kind of event during Open Access Week where we can engage all the centers and CRPs to talk about what they're doing, perhaps ideally launch the beta version of open.cgiar.org, and then work with GODAN, the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative, in a more outward-facing advocacy event. And then in December, actually start looking at what sort of progress we've made over those first 6 months. I know I'm running out of time, so I don't want to belabor this, but we've tried to put together a graphic. This is something that we may use. We'll modify it a bit internal as part of our advocacy campaign, but just to show how the pieces fit together. You know, starting with the policy, then going to the guidelines and the support pack to actually the development of those implementation plans from the centers. And then the goal being, you know, these different repositories, but being able to pull them together to be able to collect, archive, describe, and share data, information, and knowledge. And then through that, once we've actually got that working, overall sort of enhance the discoverability and interoperability through the metadata. Just to rehash this slide that I showed before, this highlights the challenge of advocacy coming out of our team and this initiative. We have to be able to find a way to advocate to all of these communities and through all of these communities to, I don't want to say sell, but promote the value of open access and why this is of value to the consortium and to our overall mission. Finally, when we talk about advocacy, what I tried to do was list a few of the challenges we have and then some of the opportunities that advocacy can actually help us address. So the first one has been addressed already. There was no open access policy, and we had to develop this consortium-wide policy, and we did that. But that involved a lot of advocacy. That involved engaging with the legal community, with the researchers. It involved getting, not just advocating, but actually working with to get their feedback, to understand their needs, so that we could understand this from a science perspective. This wasn't just a group of knowledge managers saying you must do this. So advocacy was used internally to help actually get to agreement around this. There was a big concern around resources to do this, so and a little bit of a disconnect, I must say, between donors and researchers, where donors thought that this would be something that would be easy to do, and we had to actually advocate for the challenges that researchers and research centers would face. So we had to advocate to funders who were willing to support open access, but explained that, you know, some of the challenges so that they could see this was no small feat. Then comes the issue of centers saying, okay, fine, we have a policy, we're going to get funding, but how do we actually implement? Well, so that's when we're working with centers to co-create these implementation guidelines in a way that are flexible enough, but also helpful enough. Then comes the challenge of researchers saying, well, you know, this your policy is way too aggressive, and there's no way we can, you know, make data available this swiftly. And we have to remind people that they are aspirational, but that if we want to be leaders in open access, we need to find a way to do this. And some of the data, a lot of the data, could be available within these timelines, and those data sets we must make available. Because if we wait 3 to 5 years, that data isn't actually, you know, we could be missing opportunities to help our ultimate stakeholders. Then there is the key point that we can't just be introspective. We can't just look within CGIAR. We have to work with other agricultural research for development organizations, and the real opportunity there is to work through CIARD and GODAN to collaborate. As I mentioned, as shown on the previous slide, open access does touch everyone, so we are going to have to develop a much more comprehensive campaign to overall promote this initiative, but also show how it benefits them, what's in it for them, and how it can make their lives better and contribute to the greater goals of CGIAR. All of this is going to require culture change, but as I've put here, I think the opportunity here is that CGIAR culture could use a shakeup. I think there's a real opportunity here to be leaders, to look at the way we do our research, and to abide by the mission of the new reform to really actually get our information not just out to the scientific community, but down to our ultimate stakeholders. And then how do we reach multiple target audiences? Well, one of the things that we're looking at in the Open Access Implementation Working Group is this creating a cadre of open access ambassadors who aren't just knowledge managers, aren't just data managers, but are also HR people, or legal IP people who can help disseminate that message and get people on board. And then really making the case for open access, the value of it, why. Well, there's some great tools in the CIARD Advocacy Toolkit and through GODAN. So that is it from me as from the slides. I wanted to make sure, and I know Johannes and Emma wanted to make sure there was time for questions and discussion. So Johannes, turn it back over to you.